She laid still in the darkness, her breath shallow, her limbs limp beneath velvet sheets, just as they expected her to be. Through the crack in the bedroom door their voices floated in, soft, low, and heavy with something Morel couldn't quite name. "She doesn't deserve this," the girl whispered. Alden's voice followed, tight with exhaustion. "I know. But I don't know what else to do." Morel's throat tightened. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. Was it pity? Betrayal? Something worse? She had set the trap. She had staged every moment of her suffering, every stumble, every sigh. But nothing could have prepared her for this, the ache of not knowing what her husband felt, when he wasn't pretending. Would you fake an illness just to test your partner's love? Hit that like button if trust means everything to you. And stay till the end, because the truth will shock you. She could barely swallow past the dryness in her throat. Was this what she wanted? To be invisible in her own home, watching her husband's kindness bloom for someone else? She had told herself this was about truth, about peeling back comfort to find something real. But now, wrapped in silence, she felt more like a stranger in her marriage than ever before. She remembered the early days, the way Alden used to touch her lower back. When passing by, the way he'd get lost in her poems, lost in her. But now, he barely lingered. The soft murmur of Thalia's laugh beyond the door pulled Morel back to the present. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down the sides of her face. She couldn't stand. She couldn't scream. All she could do was listen. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like control. It felt like defeat. She used to believe she knew him, Alden, with his quiet strength and warm, calloused hands. A man who rose before the sun to build homes with his own 2 hands, and once swore he'd never let her feel small. But here she was, small, watching from a shadowed bed while Thalia set the breakfast table, and Alden laughed. Not the polite kind he'd reserved for Morel lately, but something easy, unfiltered. Morel had convinced herself this was necessary, that if he still loved her at her lowest, she could finally rest in that love. But what if love wasn't what she found? What if Thalia had become more than just help? Morel's hand curled into the edge of the blanket. She wanted to get up, to scream, to confess, but instead, she lay there, trapped in a story she had written, with no idea how it would end. People think betrayal comes loud, through shouting, broken glass, slammed doors, but sometimes it creeps in through kindness, through a shared glance, a quiet smile that doesn't belong to you anymore. Morel never imagined herself becoming this version of a woman, measuring, silence for meaning, aching for a truth she might not survive. And yet, here she was, lying still, waiting for her husband to prove her wrong or confirm her worst fear. This wasn't just a test of love. It was a test of herself, of what she believed about loyalty, about her own worth without beauty, energy, or ease. A game she thought she controlled. But love, real love, isn't always loud, and neither is loss. What she didn't know as she stared at the ceiling was that the truth, raw and unexpected, was already on its way, and it would change everything. The first time Morel saw Alden Winter, he was standing at the far end of an art gallery in Richmond, studying a painting no one else seemed to notice. Not the bold landscapes or polished oil portraits most visitors admired, but a charcoal sketch, faint, unframed, and raw. He didn't glance around to see who watched him. He just stood there, arms crossed, as if the strokes on the canvas were speaking only to him. Morel, quietly clutching her notebook by the refreshment table, didn't know why. But she wrote a line about him that night. Some men walk into a room, others stay on your mind without saying a word. She didn't expect to see him again. But 3 days later, at the same cafe she wrote her poetry in, there he was, coffee in one hand, a blueprint in the other. He looked up. Their eyes met. He smiled, but not in the way most men smile when they want to be noticed. His expression was curious, not hungry. They talked, once, then again, and again. By the 3rd week, she had memorized the way he stirred his drink, always, with his left hand, and how he read the news but skipped the headlines. Alden's story was one Morel had only read about in profiles and magazines, a boy from Petersburg who built homes. By day, read zoning codes by night, and turned a $10,000 inheritance into a real estate empire. But what fascinated Morel wasn't his wealth or ambition. It was the fact that he still remembered every splinter he got from framing his first property. He didn't speak to impress. He asked about her, Her writing, her quiet childhood, the way she said words like stillness and bruise as if they had weight. When they fell in love, it felt weightless. There was no grand performance, no excessive courting, just late-night dinners in small restaurants, hands held during book readings, mornings filled with silence and comfort. Their wedding was held by the water, attended only by a few close friends. Morel wore a second-hand lace dress. Alden wore a jacket that used to belong to his father. Neither of them cried during the vows. They didn't need to. The real tears came 6 months later, when Morel showed Alden the first sonogram of the child they didn't plan for but already loved. Their life in Northern Virginia unfolded quietly. Alden expanded his company. His properties multiplied, each one designed with the kind of attention most builders reserve for their own homes. He still left the house before sunrise, still walked every construction site, but he always came home for dinner, even if late. Morel stayed home with Lennox, painting while he napped, writing between school drop-offs and snack breaks. She had always imagined herself in a cramped city apartment, surrounded by paperbacks and coffee mugs. Instead, she found herself in a house with cathedral ceilings, wine, cabinets she barely touched, and 3 guest rooms she never entered. At first, it felt like a reward for a life she didn't expect to have. But over time, the weightlessness that once defined their love began to settle into something heavier. Not broken, just quieter. Alden still loved her. She knew that. But he no longer studied her face like it was the first time. No longer asked her to read him poems in bed. He brought her gifts, handbags, perfumes, weekend spa packages, but she noticed they were the kinds of things other men gave other wives. Not what Alden used to give her. Not dog-eared notebooks or frames for her paintings. Not time. He was kind, attentive even. But she began to feel like a chapter he had already read. Morel told herself it was normal. That life changes after children, after success. That maybe love matures into routine and that was okay. But in quiet moments, brushing her hair in the mirror, she would pause and wonder, would he still love me if I was nothing but my words and silence again? Not beautiful, not easy to live with, not well, just me. The doubts didn't arrive like a thunderclap. They crept in during quiet mornings. Alden would kiss her forehead before leaving, keys in hand, phone already buzzing. Morel would stand in the foyer, robe tied loosely, watching his car pull away, the warmth of his lips fading faster each time. Lennox would tug at her hand, asking for breakfast, for his blue cup, not the green one. She'd smile, oblige, then sit in the kitchen and stare at her half-eaten toast. She had everything, at least everything people said should make her happy. A healthy son, a beautiful home, a husband who provided without complaint. But there was a loneliness that refused to leave. When friends visited, Morel put on her best smile. They complimented the house, the light fixtures, the marble floors. They whispered envy when Alden walked by, shirt sleeves rolled up, tie loose, speaking gently to Lennox. You're so lucky, one said. He's perfect. Morel nodded, lips curved. But inside, the smile cracked. She wasn't looking for perfection. She had once been drawn to Alden's roughness, the way he sanded his hands, raw, without flinching, the way he listened without trying to fix. Now, everything felt polished and distant. One afternoon, while organizing the storage room, Morel found a box of their early memories, sketches, poems, handwritten notes they used to leave on the refrigerator. She sat cross-legged on the floor, reading one from Alden. I'd rather build a life with you than a city without you. She clutched the note to her chest and closed her eyes. She missed that man. Not the businessman who attended development briefings. Not the man on magazine covers. But the one who once showed up at her poetry reading with a single sunflower because roses felt too obvious. That night, she stood before the mirror in their bathroom, makeup wiped clean, a simple cotton dress hanging on her frame. Alden walked in, his voice soft. You okay? She nodded. Just tired. He kissed her cheek, mumbled something about an early meeting, and went to bed. She stood there another 15 minutes, just looking. The next day, Morel began noticing small things. How Alden's eyes didn't lift from his phone when she spoke. How he'd forget she was painting again. How Lennox would say, Mommy, talk louder, even when she wasn't whispering. She wasn't fading. She was being faded out. She didn't think Alden meant harm. But something had shifted. The kind of shift that doesn't make noise, but changes the temperature in a room. And with that shift, a question rooted itself deep in her chest. If I lost everything that made me easy to love, would he still stay? She didn't ask him, not because she feared the answer, but because she feared he might not understand the question. So she crafted a different kind of question, one not spoken, but lived. It began with a yawn she didn't feel, a stumble that didn't come from imbalance, a doctor's visit that led to a shrug, and over time, a version of herself that needed to be carried. Her plan wasn't born out of cruelty. It came from hunger, a quiet, desperate need to be seen again, not for how she stood beside him, but for who she was without strength. If Alden could still love her through that, maybe, just maybe, everything wasn't lost. But the one thing she hadn't planned for, the thing that would rattle her, more than weakness or fear, was the presence of someone else in the house. A presence with gentle hands and listening eyes. It started with a small pause, barely noticeable to anyone else, but loud in Morel's mind. She was in the garden, clipping herbs for dinner, when she suddenly let the scissors fall and pressed a hand to her forehead. The sun wasn't harsh, and she had eaten, but she told herself to sway a little as she walked back inside. Alden didn't notice. That night, she lay awake longer than usual, listening to his breathing beside her. She counted his exhales the way one might count lies, slowly, carefully. In the morning, she asked herself again, was this necessary? But there was no loud answer, just a tug beneath her ribs that said, you need to know. So she made her choice. The first phase was harmless, simple fatigue. Morel stopped taking her afternoon walks. She left a few paintbrushes and water for days. She'd sigh between sentences, eyes heavy, but always insisted, I'm fine. Alden raised a brow the first few times, offered to book a checkup, but when she dismissed it, he moved on. The second phase came 2 weeks later. She dropped a glass in the kitchen, claiming she had lost her balance. She began forgetting things, small things. Lennox's library day, the name of Alden's new project. Still, Alden didn't panic. He brought home supplements. He asked the housekeeper to prepare more iron-rich meals. He said, you're probably just low on something. But by the third phase, Morel stopped getting out of bed altogether. She kept her face pale with minimal makeup. She allowed her hair to tangle. She muttered apologies when she couldn't lift the kettle or hold Lennox for more than a moment. Doctors came. Blood work. Scans. Everything returned normal. Could be stress, one said. She seems fine neurologically, said another. Morel listened quietly, nodding, eyes lowered. Each time Alden left the room with a specialist, she watched him. How his brow furrowed, how he scrolled through his phone with his lips tight. But he was still present, still kissed her temple, still slept beside her, still not asking the hard questions. One morning, as she lay propped against her pillows, Lennox patted in with a book. His tiny socks made no sound. Mommy, he whispered, why don't you stand anymore? She smiled, weakly. Mommy's just tired, baby. He looked at her for a long moment. But you were walking last night. To the sink. I saw you. Her breath caught. Sweetheart, sometimes people feel better for a little while, but they still need rest. Lennox didn't nod. He just tilted his head. Okay. But the way he walked out told her he didn't believe it. Children know more than they let on, especially when they're not the ones being watched. That evening, Alden brought home 2 nurses to interview. They'll take shifts, he said, setting down his briefcase. I hate leaving you like this. It's not right. Morel turned her head slowly. You don't have to hire anyone. I do, he said, because I can't be here enough. There it was again. Not enough. She wasn't angry. She didn't blame him. But something about the way he said it made her want to scream. She had created this cage. Now she had to live in it. But Alden, he was still outside it, trying to knock on windows she had painted shut. And just as the final layer of her performance settled into place, Alden mentioned bringing someone else in. A live-in helper. Someone who can manage the house, help the nurses, make things easier. She blinked slowly, feigning confusion. You mean, like a maid? Yes, just someone calm, discreet, family recommended. Morel nodded, but deep inside, something twisted. She hadn't planned for that. She hadn't planned for her. Have you ever tested someone's loyalty, only to find yourself lost in the outcome? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. This story is just beginning. Her name was Thalia. Alden said it with ease, like someone remembering a distant cousin from childhood, which, as it turned out, wasn't far from the truth. She's my uncle's daughter, he explained, pouring Mirelle a glass of water. She's between jobs, but she's always been reliable. Thought she could help out for a while. Mirelle nodded from the pillow, lips parted but silent. Reliable, not professional, not trained, but family. It was a smart decision, reasonable, responsible. And yet, the moment Thalia stepped into the house, Mirelle felt her chest tighten. Thalia was soft-footed, observant, and young. There was something in the way she moved, graceful, unassuming, but not timid. She never raised her voice, never lingered where she wasn't asked to be. And yet, within days, she had found a rhythm in the house that made Mirelle feel like a guest in her own life. She folded towels with perfect corners. Lennox adored her. Even the dog, who usually barked at visitors for a week straight, followed her from room to room like an old friend. Mirelle told herself not to read into things. But the mind, especially one already heavy with doubt, reads everything. From her bed, Mirelle watched Alden walk into the kitchen one morning, pause when he saw Thalia preparing coffee, and smile. A real smile. Not the distracted nod he gave when Mirelle asked how his day had been. Not the tight-lipped expression he wore during work calls. It was the kind of smile a man wears when he forgets he's tired. Thalia responded with a soft laugh, tucking a curl behind her ear as she answered some question Mirelle couldn't hear. Mirelle didn't speak, didn't move, just kept her eyes half closed, waiting for the moment to pass. Later that evening, Alden came into the bedroom, loosened his tie, and sat beside her on the bed. "She's settling in well," he said. "The house already feels calmer." Mirelle turned her head slightly, feigning drowsiness. She's very organized. Brings order to things." He looked at her, waiting, maybe even hoping for a response, but she just nodded, barely. And in that silence, something else settled between them, something quiet and unnamed. The fourth phase of Mirelle's act began a few days later. She stopped speaking unless spoken to. She let her hair grow tangled again. She stared at the ceiling when Alden spoke, blinking slowly, deliberately, detached but present. It wasn't cruelty. It was control, and it was working. He began checking in more often, leaving voice notes on her phone, sending her poems he'd found online, asking Lennox how she seemed when he was away. But even as he showed more concern, his laughter downstairs still rang louder with Thalia than it ever did in their bedroom. One night, Mirelle heard footsteps near the door. She shifted just enough to let the voices trickle in. "She's not improving," Thalia said softly. "She barely speaks. She doesn't deserve this," she added. A pause. "I know," Alden replied, voice heavy, "but I don't know what else to do." Mirelle clenched her jaw. That phrase again. She doesn't deserve this. What did that mean? Pity? Guilt? Was she becoming a burden he pitied but couldn't walk away from? Or worse, was she already being replaced? She lay awake until the morning light crept through the blinds, eyes dry and wide. She'd asked for clarity. She'd invited truth. But now that it was near, it wasn't clean. It was murky, blurred by kindness, complicated by care, wrapped in the soft voice of a girl who wasn't even trying to steal anything, but somehow had more of Alden's attention than Mirelle had in months. When Thalia brought her tea that afternoon, Mirelle pretended to be asleep. She heard the tray click softly against the nightstand. She heard Thalia whisper to Lennox in the hallway, "Shh, Mommy needs rest." She waited for the sound of the door to close, the quiet of the room to return. And then, with aching limbs, Mirelle sat up, just for a moment. Just long enough to look around the room and whisper to no one, "What am I doing?" Mirelle stood just long enough to make it to the window before her legs began to tremble, not from illness, but from holding in too much for too long. Outside, Alden's car pulled into the drive. Lennox rushed out the front door, barefoot as usual, holding a drawing he'd made. Alden bent down, lifted him, laughed. That laugh again, the one that used to belong to her. She leaned on the frame, her fingers pale from the pressure. She wanted to cry, but the tears refused to come, not because she wasn't broken, but because she was still pretending, even to herself. The fifth phase began with silence. She stopped answering questions with full sentences, stopped eating meals at the same time, refused to let the nurses dress her or brush her hair. She became hollow, a set piece in her own life. But in those quiet hours, when the house slowed, when Alden took a call in, his study and Thalia read stories to Lennox in the den, Mirelle listened, observed, measured everything by what wasn't said. Alden didn't flirt. He didn't disappear at odd hours. He didn't forget to check on her. But he also didn't linger in their room. He didn't trace her cheek with his thumb anymore. He didn't ask, "Are you okay?" with that boyish concern that used to melt her. Mirelle kept her journal in the drawer beside the bed, mostly blank, except for a single page written in pencil. I needed truth, but maybe what I needed more was to be held. She looked at it often, wondering whether she had passed the point of being held at all. One morning, she pretended to sleep as Alden adjusted her blanket. His hand hovered at her shoulder. He stared at her for a long time, then whispered, "Come back to me, Mirelle." The door closed, and for the first time in weeks, she cried, not from fear or doubt, but shame. She hadn't realized how much he was still trying, but it was Lennox who changed everything. He climbed into her bed quietly one night, holding his stuffed fox. "Mommy." She turned her head slowly, her voice hushed. "Yes, baby." He looked at her closely, brows drawn together. "Are you pretending?" Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I saw you, last night. You were walking. To the kitchen." Mirelle blinked, pulse roaring in her ears. "I won't tell Daddy. I promise." She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close, burying her face in his curls. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to lie." He pulled back, eyes wide with worry. "Are you sad?" She nodded. "A little. Because of Daddy?" She opened her mouth, but nothing came. Instead, she kissed his forehead and whispered, "Because of me." The next morning, she asked the nurse to help her bathe. She picked out a soft blue dress from the back of the closet, the kind Alden used to say made her look like peace. Her hair was brushed, her lips tinted with something subtle. And that evening, as Alden sat in his study surrounded by blueprints and emails, Mirelle walked in, unaided, unshaking. He didn't see her at first, but when he did, he stood too quickly, knocking over a pen. His eyes, startled, glassy, met hers. "Mirelle." She took a breath. "We need to talk." The first time Mirelle truly saw her, not through a cracked door or across a hallway, but saw her. Thalia was on the patio with Lennox. She wore a simple cream blouse, sleeves rolled just above the elbow, and a pair of dark slacks that moved easily with her. Her hair, dark and coiled, was pulled into a loose bun, with a few curls framing her face. No makeup, no jewelry, no effort to shine, and yet she did. There was a stillness about her, not silence, not awkwardness. Stillness, the kind of presence that didn't ask to be noticed, but was. Mirelle watched from her seat by the window, hidden behind gauzy curtains, pretending to be asleep again. She saw Thalia crouch to pick up a leaf for Lennox, then smile when he asked if they could press it into a book. Her smile was warm, not wide, her posture respectful. And yet, something in Mirelle's chest tightened, not because Thalia was doing anything wrong, but because she was doing everything right. Thalia didn't hover. She didn't step beyond what was expected of her. She didn't correct anyone or make suggestions. She simply moved from task to task with quiet precision. Towels folded without creases, dishes put away in perfect stacks, plants watered just enough, not too little, not too much. Even Mirelle's bedside table was rearranged gently, the pill bottles organized, the tissues replenished, the same poetry book turned to a new page as if Thalia somehow knew which lines Mirelle had already memorized. It wasn't intrusive. That was the worst part. It was thoughtful, intentional. Alden noticed. Of course he did. He was polite but distant with most staff, never unkind, but rarely conversational. With Thalia, it was different. He'd ask her about her evening, about how Lennox was behaving, about whether the house felt too cold or too warm. Mirelle caught fragments of these exchanges as she lay still, waiting, listening. Thalia never volunteered more than necessary. She answered softly, briefly, but Alden lingered. He smiled, not forced, but familiar, like someone resting for a moment before heading into another long day. Mirelle's mind pulled up memories without her permission. Alden watching her paint in the early years, quietly setting a cup of tea beside her canvas. Alden leaving sticky notes with inside jokes on her notebook. Now, He left notes for the nurses, schedules, to-do lists, and his laughter? It came most often now from the kitchen, where Thalia sometimes hummed while cutting fruit. Not flirtation, but comfort. And in some ways, that hurt more. Thalia never asked Morel personal questions. She never intruded into conversations. But she looked at her, not with pity, not with suspicion, but something softer, like someone who could see right through the surface, but chose not to say a word. It unnerved Morel more than she cared to admit. "Where is she from?" Morel asked Alden one evening, her voice slow and raspy. He looked up from his laptop. "Originally, Charlotte, I think. Her dad was my uncle on my mom's side. We lost touch for years. She's young." He nodded. Early 20s. Came up here for work but didn't settle anywhere long term. She stayed with a few family members. Just needed a break. "A break," Morel echoed. He didn't notice the weight in her tone. Or maybe he did, and didn't know how to address it. That night, as Morel lay in bed with the lights off, she heard footsteps again. Not Alden's, not the nurse's. Thalia, perhaps, checking on something in the hallway. A shadow paused by the door. Morel didn't move. She listened. The handle didn't turn. No words were spoken. But somehow, she felt seen, and it made her feel more exposed than ever. In the days that followed, Morel found herself becoming more alert, not physically stronger, not yet, but watchful. A strange sharpness had returned to her senses, the kind that surfaces when something precious feels threatened, even if you can't quite name what that something is. She started listening more closely when Alden spoke to Thalia, marking every word, every pause. "You've got away with Lennox," he said once. Morel heard it from upstairs. He doesn't usually warm up to people this quickly. Thalia's voice, steady as ever. "He's a bright kid. You both raised him well." A harmless exchange. Polite, measured, but the familiarity in Alden's tone lingered like perfume that doesn't belong to you. Morel stared longer in the mirror these days. Her face looked different, not in the way illness would shape it, but in the way fear quietly rearranges someone. Was she really fading? Or was she afraid of being replaced by someone who didn't try to shine, yet somehow glowed anyway? Alden's affection hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt exclusive, and that was what unsettled her, not because she feared Thalia's intentions, but because she couldn't be certain about Alden's. One afternoon, while Morel pretended to nap, she overheard Thalia and Lennox having a quiet conversation in the next room. "Why is Mommy always sleeping?" he asked. Thalia hesitated. "Sometimes grown-ups get tired in ways we can't see. Is she sad?" "I think maybe she's sorting through some things." Lennox was quiet. "Then, she used to dance in the kitchen." Thalia didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was gentle. "Maybe she will again. Some things take time." Morel bit down hard on the inside of her cheek. She wanted to storm into the room and scream, "You don't know me. You don't know us." But that wasn't true. Thalia had been in the house for barely a few weeks, and she had noticed things Alden hadn't mentioned in months. That evening, Alden came upstairs with a bowl of fruit. "Thalia said you barely touched dinner," he said, setting it down beside her. Morel blinked. "So, she reports to you now?" He raised an eyebrow. "No, she just cares." "Does she?" Morel asked, too softly for it to sound like an accusation, but not soft enough to feel innocent. Alden sat at the foot of the bed, quiet for a moment. "You okay?" She looked away. "Just tired." "You've been tired for a long time, Morel." He didn't say it with blame. He said it like a man carrying something he didn't know how to set down, and she hated that it made her want to cry. That night, she wrote in her journal again. Maybe Thalia isn't the threat. Maybe she's the mirror. Morel closed the notebook and tucked it back under the mattress. Thalia's background remained mostly unspoken. She never mentioned family, never referred to old jobs, never scrolled endlessly on her phone like the younger staff had done in years past. She spent her evenings reading or doing crossword puzzles. When Morel once asked her what she studied, Thalia replied simply, "Literature. But life's the thing I've learned the most from." She said it without pride or bitterness, just as fact, and Morel realized this woman who had entered her home as a helper was nothing like the threat she had imagined. There were no sideways glances, no false modesty, no hidden agenda, just a girl with quiet wisdom and hands that brought calm wherever they moved. But the real shift didn't come from Thalia's presence. It came from Morel's growing awareness of herself, of how far she had drifted from the person she used to be, of how deeply she had tied her worth to being needed. Late one night, as Alden came in to check on her, Morel stirred. "I watched you today," she murmured. He paused. "What do you mean?" "You were in the kitchen, laughing with her." He exhaled slowly. "You were watching?" "I always watch." There was no accusation in her voice, just fatigue. Not from faking an illness, from faking strength. He sat beside her, hands clasped. "I miss you," he said. Morel looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in weeks, she saw the lines beneath his eyes, the tightness in his shoulders, the quiet ache of a man trying and not knowing how to reach someone who had stepped away without leaving. "I miss me too," she whispered. It was just past 11 p.m. when Morel heard footsteps pause outside her door. She had been lying still, eyes closed, her breath slow and measured. The soft hum of the house had lulled her into a trance, but the voices pulled her back. "She doesn't deserve this," Thalia whispered. A pause. "I know," Alden said, "but I don't know what else to do." The silence that followed hit harder than the words. Morel stared at the ceiling, her pulse thudding beneath her skin like a slow drum beat. Her throat tightened, her fingers curled beneath the blanket. What didn't she deserve? Was it pity? Disgust? Was she being a burden? Or was she already being discussed like a puzzle neither of them could solve? Her mind turned to dust. Thoughts flitted in and out, none of them staying long enough to land. Alden's voice had sounded tired, not annoyed, not cold, just lost. But it was Thalia's words that echoed loudest. She didn't sleep that night. Not really. She drifted in and out of half-dreams, blinking at the shadows across the wall, trying to silence the voice in her head that kept whispering, "You pushed him away, and now someone else is reaching for him." By morning, the feeling hadn't lifted. If anything, it had deepened. When Alden brought her tea and leaned over to kiss her forehead, she flinched. He didn't say anything, just stood quietly before walking out, closing the door with a care that stung more than if he'd slammed it. Later that afternoon, Lennox crawled into bed beside her with his crayons. "Can I draw here?" he asked, already spreading the paper. She nodded, brushing his curls back gently. He looked up after a while, studying her face. "Are you still sick?" Morel hesitated. "A little." He nodded once, then kept coloring. Then, so softly it nearly slipped past her, he said, "You looked better last night." She froze. He kept his eyes on his drawing. "You walked. I saw you." A breath caught in her chest. "Where were you?" She whispered. "Bathroom," he answered. "I wanted my dinosaur. I saw you walk to the sink. You weren't holding the wall or anything." Her hand trembled. "Lennox." He turned toward her now. "Crayons forgotten. Are you pretending?" he asked. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, then whispered, "Yes." It wasn't planned. She hadn't meant to confess. Not to him. Not yet. But there it was, plain and small between them, like a toy left out in the hallway, harmless to the eye, devastating if stepped on in the dark. "Why?" he asked. She pulled him close, her voice thin and shaking. "Because sometimes adults get scared, and when they don't know how to ask for love, they ask for it the wrong way." He pressed his cheek into her chest. "Is Daddy mad at you?" "No," she whispered. "He doesn't know." Lennox looked up, wide-eyed. "I won't tell." Her heart cracked, not from guilt alone, but from the weight of being protected by a child who didn't even know what he was holding. She sat up in bed after he left, not slowly, not carefully. She sat up. Her body had forgotten how good it felt to move freely. Her legs dangled over the side, her fingers flexed, her spine straightened. No audience, no script, just her and the truth, heavy, undeniable, and finally louder than her fear. It was time to stop pretending. Has a child ever told you a truth you weren't ready to hear? Drop a comment below if kids have ever surprised you with their wisdom. And if this moment hit you, hit that like button too. She stood at the threshold of Alden's study, barefoot, unsure if she was trembling from nerves or release. Her legs, used to stillness, now bore the weight of a moment she had postponed for far too long. Alden sat at his desk, back to the door, shoulders hunched as he stared at blueprints spread across the table. His sleeves were rolled up. His tie sat discarded beside his laptop. He looked like the man she first met, the man who studied lines and spaces, not just to build homes, but to create something that held meaning. She took a breath. Alden. He turned, and for the first time in weeks she saw it, that spark of shock that flickered before emotion overtook it. He rose slowly. She expected confusion, anger, questions, but he didn't speak. Not right away. Instead, he walked toward her carefully, as though afraid she might collapse. "I'm not sick," Morel said. Her voice wasn't steady. He nodded, lips pressed tightly together. "I know." She blinked. "You know?" "I've known for a while." The silence between them stretched, dense and suffocating. "I saw you one night," he continued, voice low. "You walked onto the balcony. I was in the car about to pull out. The lights were off inside, but I saw you, moving freely, not limping, just walking." She swallowed hard. "Why didn't you say anything?" Alden looked at her for a long time, then motioned to the couch by the far wall. "Can you sit?" She hesitated, then crossed the room and lowered herself onto the edge of the cushion. He sat beside her, elbows on his knees. "I didn't say anything," he said slowly, "because I figured you weren't just playing a game. You were hurting. You needed something, from me, from yourself, that you couldn't ask for directly." Morel stared at the floor. He glanced at her, eyes shadowed. "I didn't know if confronting you would help. I thought maybe you needed time, space, so I gave it. And yes, I brought Thalia because I didn't know what else to do." There it was again. That line, "I don't know what else to do." She looked up. "You and Thalia." He shook his head. "She's my cousin Morel. Her father and my mom were siblings. We weren't close growing up, but she moved up here recently. She was staying with my aunt when I called." Morel's breath caught. "She's family?" "Yes. And you didn't tell me?" "I tried. You weren't present." The words weren't said in bitterness. They were factual, gently placed. Still, they cut. "I thought you'd come back on your own," Alden said. "But as the days passed, I realized you weren't just pretending to be sick. You were waiting for something." Morel looked at him, finally, truly. "I was afraid." He nodded. "Of what?" "That you didn't love me anymore. That everything between us had become a role we played. That I was just the quiet woman in the big house. Easy to forget." Alden leaned back. "Do you think I stayed because I felt sorry for you?" She hesitated. "Yes. Maybe." He looked hurt, and that hurt more than anything he'd said. "I didn't stay because I pitied you," he said. "I stayed because I remember every version of you. The girl who couldn't stop talking about poetry over wine. The woman who kissed our son's knees every time he fell, even when he said he was too old for it. You disappeared. Not your body. You. And instead of calling you out, I waited for the woman I married to come back on her own terms." He paused, then added, "Even if those terms included pretending to be someone else." Morel wiped her cheek. "I thought if I could test you," she whispered. "If I could see you love me at my weakest, I could believe in us again." He looked at her, his voice quiet. "You wanted to know if I'd still choose you." She nodded. "I never stopped," he said. "You just stopped seeing it." The room was silent, not cold, not empty, just still. Morel reached for his hand, slowly, almost shyly. He let her. And in that small connection, fingers brushing, palms warm, something broke loose inside her. Not guilt, not shame, just the beginning of something that had been waiting patiently to return. Honesty. Later that evening, Morel found herself standing in the kitchen. No nurses, no caretakers, no performance. She pulled mugs from the cabinet and poured tea, one for herself, one for Alden. He watched her from the entryway, arms folded, not suspicious, just observing her in a way he hadn't in months. "How long did you plan to keep it going?" he asked gently. She stirred her cup slowly. "I don't know. I think I was waiting for a sign, something that would make me believe again." "And what did Lennox give you?" he asked. She turned. "That sign." They sat at the table, hands wrapped around warm porcelain. It reminded her of the early days, before staff, before renovations, when the kitchen had creaked and nothing matched, and their life felt small but true. I hated lying, she said after a while, but I hated feeling invisible more. You were never invisible, Alden replied. You stopped seeing me. I never stopped seeing you, he said. I just didn't know how to reach you. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. I watched you fade, he admitted. Not because you weren't beautiful, you've always been beautiful, but because something in you stopped wanting to be known. Her throat tightened. I was tired of being the woman everyone expected me to be, she said. Smiling, balanced, whole. You didn't have to be whole. You just had to be honest. That silence again. This time, it settled between them differently. Not like a wall. Like a doorway. Why didn't you bring up the night you saw me walk? She asked. He sighed. Because confronting you would have made you feel cornered. And I didn't want to win an argument. I wanted you to choose to come back. Her eyes welled again. And Thalia? She stayed to help, he said. Not just with the house, with Lennox. With you. I thought... Morel began, then stopped herself. I know what you thought, Alden said. But she's not here to replace anything. She said I didn't deserve this, Morel whispered. Alden nodded. Because she saw you hurting. She didn't know what was real either. She just wanted peace in the house. Morel nodded slowly. She's good with Lennox. She is, Alden agreed. But she doesn't mother him. You do. A long pause. Then, are you angry with me? Alden looked at her. No, but I was... scared. Of what? That I was losing you. Morel lowered her head. I thought I was losing you too, she said. That's why I created a situation where I could be loved without effort. But love takes effort, Alden said softly. From both people. And testing someone's love without telling them you're being tested, it doesn't prove anything. It just builds walls. She nodded. I see that now. Later, as they walked down the hall, together, quietly, Lennox peeked out from his room. His eyes widened. Mommy. Morel smiled. Hi, baby. You're walking. I am. Can you read me a story? Alden placed a hand on her back. I'll get the book. Morel knelt down. Which one? The one with the tree that never gives up. She laughed softly. Perfect choice. That night, after Lennox fell asleep, they sat on the couch in silence. Alden reached for her hand again. And this time, she didn't hesitate. The living room felt different now. Not quieter, not louder, just truer. The week following Morel's confession unfolded like a slow breath, steady, sometimes shaky, but always forward. The first step wasn't dramatic. It was Alden returning from work with a list of therapists, names scribbled on a notepad, not typed. He placed it on the coffee table beside her without comment. Morel looked at the list, then up at him. You want us to talk to someone? I want us to talk to each other, he said. But maybe we need help doing that. She didn't resist. For once, neither of them did. Their first therapy session was on a Wednesday morning. The office was quiet, the furniture soft and neutral. The therapist, a middle-aged black woman named Mara, welcomed them with a nod that felt more like recognition than greeting. Morel expected discomfort, defensiveness, maybe even silence. But instead, there was space. Alden spoke first, not to accuse, but to explain. I didn't know how to ask what was wrong, he admitted. And when I did, I was afraid of making it worse. Morel kept her hands folded in her lap. I wanted to believe you'd fight for me, she said, even if I wasn't asking directly. And I thought, if I stayed close enough, long enough, maybe you'd open the door. Mara nodded slowly. You both waited for the other to move first. That's not uncommon, but it leaves a space where hurt grows. Over the next 3 sessions, they filled that space with hard truths. Morel talked about the loneliness that came from living in a world where everyone assumed she was fine. Alden opened up about his fear of becoming the kind of man who built buildings but couldn't keep a family together. They didn't interrupt each other. They didn't rush. They sat with the discomfort, and slowly it began to loosen. One afternoon, as they left the session, Morel turned to Alden in the parking lot. Thank you. He didn't ask for what. He just squeezed her hand, and for the first time in a long time, she felt anchored. That evening, Morel found Thalia in the laundry room folding sheets with her usual focus. She paused in the doorway. Do you have a second? Thalia looked up, eyes calm as always. Of course. Morel stepped inside. The hum of the dryer filled the space between them. I owe you an apology, Morel said. Thalia raised an eyebrow, waiting. I judged you, silently, watched you like you were taking something from me that you weren't even reaching for. Thalia didn't respond right away. Morel continued, voice steady. I assumed things about you because I was afraid, not of you, but of what I thought I'd lost in myself. Thalia placed the sheet down gently. I know, she said. I saw it. I didn't take it personally. You would have had every right to. Thalia shrugged softly. People react when they're hurting. It doesn't make them bad, just human. Morel's throat tightened. Thank you for being kind when I wasn't. Thalia nodded once. Thank you for seeing me now. They stood there in silence, not awkward, not strained, just human. And maybe healing. It was late Sunday afternoon when Morel found Lennox in the backyard, kneeling in the dirt with a small plastic shovel, digging a shallow hole beneath the hydrangeas. She stepped outside quietly, her slippers brushing the wooden steps. The breeze was soft, and the sky had that golden color it only wore for. A few minutes each day, like a gift handed out and then tucked away again. What are you up to, little fox? She asked. Lennox looked over his shoulder, his nose scrunched with determination. Burying my wish, he said. Morel smiled, crouching beside him. A wish. He nodded, brushing soil from his hands. I wrote it on paper, then I folded it and put it in a baggie so the worms don't eat it. What did you wish for? He paused. I can't tell. Then it won't come true. She nodded. Of course. But she watched him carefully as he patted the dirt back over the hidden note. His hands were so small. His world so tender. And she'd lied to that world. Not with cruelty, but still, when he stood, she pulled him into her arms and held him longer than usual. I'm sorry, she said softly into his hair. For what? He asked, blinking up at her. For not being honest with you, for making you carry something you didn't have words for yet. He rested his cheek against her shoulder. It's okay, he said after a while. You're here now. Sometimes children don't forgive with grand speeches. They just let you stay. Later that evening, Morel opened her studio door for the first time in months. The scent of turpentine and old brushes filled her lungs like memory. Dust floated in thin shafts of light from the high windows, catching on the edges of canvases left half-finished. She ran her hand over a stool, tracing where her fingertips used to rest. There was a blank canvas prop near the back, one she had primed and left untouched. She stood before it, bare feet on hardwood, and didn't reach for a brush right away. She just stood, present, unhidden. That night, Alden peeked in while passing by. You're painting? Not yet, she said, but I'm ready to. He nodded, smiling. You look more like you. She tilted her head. That's what I'm trying to remember. He didn't push, didn't ask what the painting would be about. He just walked over, kissed her cheek, and left the door open behind him. She liked that. It meant she could return to herself without shutting out the world she loved. The next day, Morel picked up her brush. The first stroke was hesitant. The second, firmer. By the fifth, the rhythm had returned. Not the old rhythm, but a new one. Messier, more emotional, and somehow more alive. She wasn't painting to display it in a gallery. Not to impress anyone. Not to sell. She painted because it was the only way she knew to speak the parts of herself that words couldn't carry. Each stroke said, I'm still here. Each color whispered, I'm becoming something again. A week passed. Then two. There were no sweeping gestures, no dramatic moments of reconciliation, just consistency, quiet steps, repeated effort. Alden began coming home earlier, sometimes with paint samples, sometimes with books Morel had mentioned months ago. He didn't flood her with questions. He simply offered presence, and she began responding, not with perfection, but with truth. There were days she still felt unsure, days where guilt shadowed her joy, but she didn't retreat, not anymore. They continued therapy, not because they were broken, but because they understood now. Rebuilding isn't about returning to what was. It's about constructing something better, stronger, out of what survived. One session, Morel admitted, I thought love meant never being doubted, but I see now, love survives doubt. That's how it proves itself. Alden nodded slowly. And I thought loyalty was about standing by someone, but it's also about asking the hard questions when silence becomes too heavy. Mara smiled. That's called learning to stay awake in love, Most people fall asleep in it. They both smiled back. They weren't asleep anymore. Thalia decided to move out by the 3rd month. She sat at the kitchen table with Morel, sipping tea as they talked. "I think you've got your rhythm back," Thalia said, not unkindly. "You were never the threat I thought you were," Morel replied, her voice quiet. Thalia smiled. Sometimes when people heal, it's not about removing what hurt them, it's about realizing what didn't. They hugged. It wasn't emotional in the way goodbyes often are. It was warm, sincere, free of unfinished things. Morel knew they'd stay in touch, not as employer and employee, not even as family, but as two women who had seen one another clearly and chosen kindness. That night, Morel tucked Lennox into bed. He reached out, holding her wrist. "Are you better now?" "I'm getting better," she said. "Every day." "Are you still scared?" She thought about it. "Sometimes." He nodded, satisfied. "Me too. But I still like mornings." "Why?" "Because I don't know what's going to happen yet. That makes it feel new." She kissed his forehead, her heart swelling with something tender and painful and beautiful all at once. From a child's mouth, simple but true. Downstairs, Alden was washing dishes. She walked up behind him, slid her arms around his waist. He leaned back into her touch. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For staying." He turned, drying his hands. That's what love does. They stood there, forehead to forehead. No fireworks, no applause, just the quiet return to a partnership that had weathered its own storm. In the studio that night, Morel signed the corner of her newest painting. It wasn't symmetrical. The lines bled a little, but it felt honest. And as she stepped back to look at it, messy, bold, unfinished, she realized something. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to Alden, not to herself, not even to love. Some stories are loud, full of betrayal, broken doors, raised voices. This wasn't that kind of story. This one unfolded in whispers, in looks that lingered a moment too long, in questions never asked out loud, in silence that pressed harder than words ever could. It's easy to think love is loud, dramatic, immediate, that we'll know without a doubt when something is wrong or right. But the truth is, love often hides in the quietest corners. This was a story about a woman who needed proof, not of her husband's devotion, but of her own worth, and a man who waited, not out of weakness, but because he knew that forcing someone to speak before they're ready doesn't create connection, it creates fear. Morel didn't fake illness because she wanted attention. She did it because somewhere along the way, she stopped believing that who she was, without beauty, energy, and performance, could still be enough. How many people walk through their own homes unsure of their place? How many marriages suffer in silence, not from infidelity, but from distance? Morel's story speaks to something deeper than wealth, health, or even romance. It speaks to the quiet desperation of wanting to be seen, to be held, to be chosen, without asking. But here's the lesson. When we stop communicating, when fear becomes stronger than honesty, we don't just lose trust in others. We lose trust in ourselves. Alden wasn't perfect. He missed the signs. He didn't ask the hard questions soon enough, but he stayed. He did what so many run from. He remained when it was uncomfortable. When the woman he loved became unrecognizable, he didn't replace her. He waited to meet her again. That's what commitment looks like. Not just showing up in celebration, but standing firm in confusion too. Thalia represented something else entirely. She wasn't a threat. She was a reflection. She offered care without condition. She reminded Morel what it looked like to serve without seeking validation, and her presence forced Morel to confront a truth she'd avoided for too long. The threat wasn't another woman. It was the version of herself she feared no one could love. Children see more than we give them credit for. Lennox watched his mother fall apart quietly. He watched his father try without always succeeding. And when the moment came, it wasn't an adult who broke the silence. It was a 6-year-old with a soft voice and wide eyes, asking the one question Morel couldn't hide from. Why do you pretend? Sometimes it takes the simplest words to shake the deepest lies. What would you have done if you were Alden? Or Morel? Would you have waited? Would you have confessed? Let us know in the comments. Your story might help someone else who's standing at that same crossroads. One evening, not long after things had settled, Lennox sat beside Morel on the porch steps, his chin resting in his hands. "Mommy," he asked, Do grown-ups lie when they're scared? Morel didn't rush to answer. She looked out toward the yard, where the wind swayed through the trees. Yes, she said softly. Sometimes we do. Lennox nodded like he already knew. But the best ones, she added, learn to tell the truth before it's too late. He looked up at her, blinking. Are you one of the best ones now? She smiled, pulling him close. I'm trying to be. That's the quiet work of healing. It doesn't always end in applause. Sometimes it ends in a whispered apology, a returned laugh, a shared silence that doesn't feel heavy anymore. Trust doesn't just fall apart from betrayal. Sometimes it erodes from neglect, from fear, from silence, from the slow fade of effort when comfort turns into assumption. But Morel and Alden found their way back, not through flowers or promises, but through the hard choice to stay in the room when the door felt easier, to keep showing up, to start over, together. Love, real love, isn't about never doubting. It's about returning to the truth, to each other, to the promise that even in imperfection, you are still worthy of being held. If you take one thing from their story, let it be this. Love doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like a man folding laundry because you can't stand, a child whispering the truth when you least expect it, a woman picking up her paintbrush again, not to prove anything, but because she finally believes she can. The story of Alden, Morel, Thalia, and Lennox isn't about drama. It's about choice, about staying, about learning how to love without conditions, without needing to be tested first. And maybe that's something all of us need to hear, not just those in marriages, not just parents or partners, but anyone who's ever questioned if their truth is too much. It isn't. If this story moved you, if it made you think about love, loyalty, or the quiet power of truth, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs this message. Because stories like this aren't just stories, they're reminders, and reminders deserve to be passed on. The garden was quiet, except for the soft thump of Lennox's feet as he chased a paper plane across the grass. Morel and Alden sat beneath the maple tree that had once marked the edge of their conversations, back when silence said more than words. Now, the space between them was filled with something else. Peace, not perfection, not certainty, but something real. Morel leaned into Alden's shoulder, her fingers tracing the inside of his palm. A quiet rhythm, a familiar comfort. You think we'll ever forget this season? She asked. He shook his head gently. No. But maybe we're not supposed to. She smiled. Not because everything was easy now, but because they had arrived here, together. They didn't tell people the full story. Not the neighbors. Not even most friends. They let the world believe what it wanted, that Morel had recovered from an illness, that Thalia had moved on with grace, that Alden had held the family together through it all. But the truth wasn't something to prove anymore. It had been lived, felt, held in the small decisions they made daily, to speak when it was hard, to listen without interrupting, to forgive not with grand declarations, but with presence. One Saturday morning, Morel walked into the kitchen to find Alden helping Lennox pour batter into a skillet. There was flour on the counter, a little on Alden's shirt, and orange juice dripping from the side of a cup. She would have scolded them once, but now she reached for a camera and snapped a picture instead. Later that afternoon, they went for a walk. Nothing fancy, no planned destination, just a shared pace. Morel's fingers laced into Alden's. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. At one point she looked up and asked, "Do you still worry?" He gave a small laugh. About what? That the first'll disappear again. That I'll go quiet. He stopped walking, turned to face her. I don't worry, he said, but I do watch. Not because I'm waiting for it to happen, but because now I know how to see it coming, and I won't miss it next time. She didn't cry, but her chest ached in the best way. Lennox ran ahead, chasing a butterfly near the fence. His laughter rang through the air, untouched, unburdened. Morel watched him, then looked at Alden. We got through it, she said. No, Alden corrected gently. We're getting through it. And she nodded. That was the truth. Healing wasn't a finish line. It was a path. One they walked side by side, with uneven steps but held hands. That night, as Morel stepped back into her studio, she opened the notebook she had once hidden under her mattress. On the last page, she wrote, I tried to stage the collapse, but love waited for me to return on my own, not to punish, not to lecture, but to hold. That's what staying looks like. She tore the page out, pressed it flat, and tucked it into the frame of her newest painting. Not for anyone else to read, just for her. A reminder of the bridge they built with honesty instead of drama. The world would go on spinning. There would be more arguments, misunderstandings, long days, missed calls. But now, there was a foundation, not made of illusions, not built on tests, but anchored in something far more durable: truth, presence, choice. Morel didn't need Alden to rescue her, and Alden didn't need Morel to prove her love through suffering. They needed only what they had rediscovered: the quiet power of showing up, of asking instead of assuming, of forgiving while still remembering. Lennox called out, "Mom, Dad, look." They turned. He was balancing on the edge of the brick path, arms wide like a bird, laughter in his voice. Morel reached for Alden's hand again, her grip firm. And as they walked toward their son, the late sunlight spilling across the lawn, a final truth settled in the air around them. They hadn't found a fairy tale. They hadn't gone back to the beginning. They'd simply chosen to move forward, with open hearts and open eyes. In choosing to stay, not perfectly, but honestly, they rewrote the ending together,